Marco Rubio on how China has changed capitalism. The senator, an outspoken critic of China, discusses COVID-19 blame, national security, and how the U.S. should counter Made in China. Senator Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants and a former Republican presidential candidate, has made China a centerpiece of his political strategy. He has joined other members of Congress in urging the U.S. to impose sanctions on Chinese officials for human rights abuses against the ethnic minority Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, China. He has said that the Chinese Communist Party's delays in alerting the world to the coronavirus has cost lives, and that America should rethink its global supply chain. China, in short, is America's strategic rival, and its companies are exploiting America's capital markets. The result, he says, is that Americans are funding a totalitarian regime. What follows is a lightly edited Q&A. Question China has been a key focus for you for some time. So let's start with COVID-19. Can you talk about China's response to the outbreak, and also whether this has changed your thinking about the global supply chain? Well, let me just say, as a general matter, the Chinese people reacted the way you would expect people to react. So, if you recall, that Dr. Li Wenliang, the Wuhan doctor, who informed everyone about the virus in December 2019 and later died after becoming ill from COVID-19, was forced to sign a document, and others were silenced too. So, let me be clear, as I've noted in every tweet and statement that I've put out, I always say, the Chinese Communist Party, because I believe they, the Chinese people, are the victims of what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. The Chinese people suffer before everybody else. With that said, there are two things at play. First, this is a reminder of our supply chain vulnerability. In this case, the disruptions and factory closings are at a time of incredible demand. But you've also seen the outlines of both veiled and some direct threats, from China, about cutting us off from having access to certain things. As a result, more countries are going to identify certain industries as national priorities, and they're going to restrict foreign investment in those sectors and exports. Right now, it's not just China. India and other countries have imposed export restrictions when they had a critical shortage of some commodity or product that they needed for their own domestic use. Countries in Europe and Asia, and the United States, will all do this sort of thing. We're going to respond in the same way. We're going to redefine what critical industries are, and after the pandemic, there's going to be some protectionism around those industries across the world. How has China handled the pandemic? The Communist Party has handled it the way totalitarian regimes always handle any sort of crisis. That is, by not being transparent, trying to cover it up by first pretending it doesn't exist, and punishing those that say it does. Then, trying to obscure how bad it is. And then trying to blame it on somebody else, while making themselves out to be the good guys. Those are the three processes totalitarian regimes generally follow during a crisis. I mean, it's stunning. In the case of Iran, their initial reaction to these infections was they didn't have it. Their second was that this was a plot by our enemies. In China, the first reaction was, we don't have a problem. The second was, we have a problem. And then the third was, we have a problem and we contained it. Now we're here to help the rest of the world, and by the way, wink wink, this problem really came from American soldiers who came to China. This is a playbook totalitarian regimes follow. And what's going to happen, as people around the world look at this, they are going to realize that responding to the global pandemic requires some of the attributes of free countries: transparency, scientific collaboration, and the sharing of information and best practices. These are attributes that you find in open societies. These are not attributes you find from totalitarian regimes or authoritarian regimes. Lots of theories have floated around about the origins of this virus. There are even some theories that maybe it emerged from the military, both the PLA or US soldiers visiting China. You've heard these things. What do you say? What I say about this is entirely based on the opinion of people who have spent a lifetime with expertise on it. I cannot independently tell you anything about a virus. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a virologist or a medical professional. That said, from all the information that I have gathered, I have not seen any evidence that this virus was altered by human activity as some sort of deliberate, manufactured virus. What is interesting, though, is that in most of these pandemics you have animal-to-human infection, a sort of naturally occurring, randomly occurring infection. You generally have a number of people infected at once. The outbreak doesn't begin with one person. It begins with various people who are exposed to that animal. In this particular case, from what I understand from the experts, there's some pretty compelling evidence that there was an initial patient 0. And it was from that one patient that others became infected. And that may suggest there was some sort of laboratory accident. But I'm not sure we will ever be able to prove that, unless the Chinese are willing to open themselves up to an international investigation about how this started. I think this is important. This is not just about assigning blame to them. This is about figuring out how to prevent something like this from happening in the future. Can we go back to the supply chain? The supply chain bottlenecks for things like medical supplies, such as masks and ventilators, have been a major concern. There have also been disputes about who gets those supplies. As you may know, most of the active ingredients for the global supply of antibiotics come from China and India. Are there inherent weaknesses in the global supply chain for critical goods? Should these goods be manufactured closer to home? Look, I'm a big supporter of capitalism. And one of the things that makes capitalism the best economic model in the world is that it allocates capital to its most efficient use. You're always going to get the most efficient outcome. There are, however, instances in which the most efficient outcome is not in our national interest. It is the most efficient outcome for the active ingredients in our generic pharmaceuticals to be made in China and other countries. It is cheaper to do it that way. But the problem is that's not in our national interest. The ability to deny us access to that or a series of other commodities or products in a time of crisis is tremendous leverage over a country. Imagine if we had some incident in the Taiwan Straits and they said, "We're going to cut off your supply of active ingredients in your medicines. And also, by the way, we're going to cut off access to rare earth minerals." This is where you could get into an armed conflict. History gives us a valuable lesson here. One of the things that triggered Japan to target the United States in December 1941 was the United States' decision to deal with Japan's aggressive behavior before World War II by denying them access to oil and access to energy resources. Armed conflict there was inevitable, but it was certainly accelerated by the ability to deny them something that was critical to their society. When Japan saw that, they decided to act proactively. And that's what I worry about in the future. Giving any country that sort of leverage over us creates the real possibility of armed conflict. It increases the possibility of the horrific consequences of armed conflict. And so on a broader scale, I think that's the kind of thing that we need to think about. It's not just about economics. This is about national security. Bob Lighthizer on changing the balance in U.S.-China trade. The Trump administration's U.S. trade representative explains why he thinks the U.S. got the raw end of economic ties with China, what he thinks of the Biden administration's approach and why the U.S. shouldn't do a trade deal with Taiwan. Robert E. Lighthizer is an attorney and longtime government official who most recently served as the U.S. trade representative during the Trump administration. Lighthizer has more than 30 years' experience as an international trade lawyer working for Skadden, ARPs, Slate, Marr and Flum LLP. He has also worked on Capitol Hill as a senior staff member and one-time chief of staff for the late Senator Bob Dole, the Kansas Republican. He also served as deputy U.S. trade representative during the Reagan administration. For much of his career, he represented trade groups and criticized U.S. trade policies that he believes have undermined America's manufacturing base and resulted in American jobs being shifted overseas. This year, he published a book, No Trade is Free, Changing Course, Taking on China, and Helping America's Workers, in which he argues strongly against the rise of the World Trade Organization and America's embrace of free trade agreements. In this lightly edited interview, we discussed China, tariffs, and his recollections of the trade battle he waged with China during the Trump administration. Some might say that you're a protectionist because you favor high tariffs, and that you don't really believe in free trade, or at least how it works in practice. You harshly criticize free trade agreements and say the World Trade Organization was a mistake and that its development has been a disaster. Is that right? Free trade is like a lot of other imaginary things. They're wonderful, as long as you're willing to stay in the imaginary world. You don't have free trade in a situation where some countries run surpluses for decades while others run deficits. That's not how we were taught that trade was supposed to work. The notion of free trade where nations take advantage of their natural competitive advantages is fine. But it doesn't exist if a country tips the scale to help themselves. So we ought to be clear-eyed about these things. I believe that, without question, the course that the United States has been on for at least the last 30 years has not served us well. The evidence shows that we have run up trillions of dollars of trade deficits. We have transferred trillions of dollars of our national wealth overseas. And there are a number of reasons for that, but one important one is that we entered into bad trade agreements. What happened in the 1990s or 2000s that changed the trajectory of the U.S.? The U.S. did three things. First, we passed NAFTA, a free trade agreement with Canada and Mexico, and that was very controversial and it barely passed. We had an agreement in 1988 with Canada, but in 1994 we added Mexico to it, during the Clinton administration. The next big thing was the implementation of the Uruguay Round Trade Negotiation, which took us from the GATT to the World Trade Organization. That was not a good agreement for the United States for a variety of reasons, including the creation of this appellate body, which is just like a global Supreme Court. This was not in the interest of our country. And then, at the end of the decade and in the beginning of the 2000s, there was a vote that gave China permanent most favored nation treatment. The United States had low tariffs for China, but they could be taken away every year, but at that time we made the favorable treatment permanent. Here is an interesting fact. Most favored nation status for China was considered by the politicians of the day to be politically difficult to sell. So they changed the name to Permanent Normal Trade Relations as a kind of a sales scheme. But we did that, and the following year China got into the WTO. So we did three things, all of which were in the same direction, and they were the result of hubris and arrogance on the part of America. There was this sense that the Cold War was over, and you read about the end of history and this whole notion that if we just trade with each other, we won't have wars anymore. We'll have prosperity. And China will become like Switzerland. This was the notion, you'll recall, that was very common in those days. The only problem is it just ignores human nature, which is not utopian. The data shows that we have been running huge trade deficits ever since. We lost many jobs in the manufacturing sector. And we also, sadly, began to see an increase in income inequality in our country. Those were three fateful policy choices, and they came from a small group of people in a bipartisan way. Some Republicans and some Democrats had this utopian view of the world, and it's turned out to be wrong and bad for the country. I believe that we should correct these mistakes. The reality is that if we transfer the ownership of our country, our equity, debt, and real property overseas, the new owners of that property get the future value of that ownership forever. What can you say about the politicians who backed those moves? Were they influenced by academic theory or think tanks? Was it Wall Street or multinational corporations? Why did it gain traction in Congress and the White House? It's a combination of things. Some of it was a normal outgrowth of what the policy had been after World War II. Also, some of these politicians were from large agricultural states, and they had a sense that they were doing relatively well by being able to sell more agricultural products. It was also academia, and some Chinese influence and just basic elitism in America. There were bankers and others who had gotten very rich, and they were less concerned about working people. So it was a combination of all those things that came together. I wrote an article in 1997 for the New York Times. You may recall that there was a scandal in the '96 election between Robert Dole, the Republican candidate for president, who I supported, and Bill Clinton. There were allegations of foreign money coming into the Clinton campaign to help him win. Clinton had originally campaigned in 1992 as a kind of a get tough on China guy. But then, by the time we got to '96, he really hadn't gotten tough on China. The foreign money was alleged to be from Indonesia. My Times article showed it really wasn't Indonesian money, it was Chinese money. And then I wrote, what does China want? It wants to get into the WTO. And if they do, there won't be a manufacturing job in America that is safe. I wrote all that in '97. So what moved this policy? It was a combination of all of this money from China, influence, and money from big business, academia, and to some extent a continuation of a previous policy. Some economists have argued that this spurred productivity and made the global system more efficient, and also that the US grew at a faster rate. That's not something you can debate. After 2000 and these three policy changes, we did not grow at a faster pace. We grew at a slower pace, and there's a lot of reasons for that. People can debate what the reasons are, but they can't debate the second thing you said, which is that to some extent consumers do benefit. But what is good for the country and the communities of working people is more important than consumption. No country became great by consuming. They all became great by producing. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are out of work. Communities are blighted by the closing of factories, families breaking up, and opioid addiction. Making communities stronger and better is what's important, not corporate profits and maximizing consumption. What's your idea of balanced trade? Let's talk about that for a moment. Do trade deficits even matter? That's the question you're asking. An economist would say, no, they don't matter. And I would say, if you have a surplus with one country and a deficit with another country, then that doesn't matter. And then I would drop a footnote and say, of course, there can be questions of composition of trade. You don't want to get in the position where a country is only trading raw materials for advanced goods. Also, if a country has a surplus for, say, 2 years and then deficits for 2 years, I would agree that doesn't matter. But that's not what's happening in the United States. In the US, we've been running hundreds of billions of dollars, and even trillions of dollars in deficits for decades. I believe that David Ricardo or Adam Smith in their day would have said, no, that can't happen because a country will run out of gold. Trade was largely in gold at that time, or its currency would depreciate sufficiently to get back to balance. But, for whatever reason, this does not happen to the United States. And some might say, well, yeah, but we get all those extra TVs and cheap toys. But what happens is that over a long period of time, if you run deficits, you're really transferring wealth from your country to the surplus countries. It's not unlike what happens in your own life. If you overconsume and then take out a mortgage, you'll eventually go broke. The reality is that if we transfer the ownership of our country, our equity, debt, and real property overseas, the new owners of that property get the future value of that ownership forever. I wrote an article for The Economist a couple of years ago. I based it on an article that Warren Buffett had written almost 20 years before, making the same point. His article was called Squanderville and Thriftville, and it was brilliant. He talked about what would happen if these huge deficits continue. You're basically losing your country. In about 2003, at the time when he wrote, the net investment position of the United States was much smaller. If you're not familiar with that data point, it calculates how much in assets all Americans own overseas versus how much everyone overseas owns in America. It's called the net investor position of a country. When Warren Buffett raised his alarm, the net investment position of the United States was a negative $2.3 trillion. That was alarming to him, and he suggested we get back to balanced trade. And where are we today in terms of the net investments? We are now at a negative $17 trillion. To give you an idea of the size of that, if you took the 100 biggest companies in America, you could buy most of them and get some change. So, we are transferring the wealth of our country and the future earnings of our country away from our children and grandchildren and giving it to other countries, including China. We're doing that in exchange, in many cases for current consumption. This is a mistake. So what are your ideas for more balanced trade and resolving the huge trade deficits? The United States could do one of three things. The one that Warren Buffett has suggested is to issue export certificates and import certificates. If you want to import something into the United States, you would buy an export certificate from an exporter. Second, you could put an access fee on incoming investment into the United States. This is called a market access fee. And the notion would be that as a foreigner buys U.S. assets, they would pay a fee set by the Federal Reserve. This would essentially make the dollar less valuable when it comes back to the United States and thus effectively reduce the value of the currency. And then the third way you can do it, which I prefer just because of the simplicity, is you can put tariffs on products coming into the United States. And if you do that, you will raise revenue and reduce the trade deficits. Obviously, any of these remedies would have to be phased in over years. What's preventing us from getting to more balanced trade? Are other nations colluding or forcing the U.S. into this position? There are countries that run large surpluses. That would include China, of course, but also Germany. Those countries are all by definition doing something to manipulate their markets and distort trade. They are somehow taking resources away from consumers and giving them to their manufacturing sectors. Absent distortions, their workers would consume more as they produced more, and this would get them back to balanced trade. So if a country is running surpluses over a long period of time, then some way or another, through the banking system or the labor laws or through subsidies, they are interfering with the markets. As the U.S. trade representative, you tried to radically alter this free trade agenda. In your book, you write that it was an historic and largely successful trade war or trade dispute with China. Can you talk about what you did and how it succeeded? Well, the Chinese have a policy that is designed to produce huge surpluses and to gain technology. They use the old tricks of limiting domestic market access, tariffs, and currency manipulation. And they combine this with some new elements, like forced technology transfers, failing to protect intellectual property, cyber espionage, industrial spying, and all that mixed together. It is designed to build up their economy and their technology. To combat this in the Trump administration, we put in place a series of tariffs. And then, over a period of time, we negotiated a trade agreement with them. We kept the tariffs in place as part of the Phase 1 agreement and made a bunch of other changes, many of which were significant. And as a result, pre-COVID, the trade deficit between the United States and China went down, I think 5 quarters in a row, year over year. So, it was working. But this was just the beginning of a process. Yet the deficits seem to have widened again, and the U.S. does not seem significantly better off in terms of balanced trade. What should happen now? What I propose in my book is what I call strategic decoupling. Not decoupling of all economic activity. Of course, we should have economic relations with China, but they should be balanced. We should buy about the same amount from them as they buy from us. And we have to be very careful with our technology. And we have to be very careful with outgoing and incoming investment from China. These are some of the next steps that we have to be taking. What we did in the Trump administration was a very successful change in direction, and that was historic. More needs to be done and more will be done. I do not believe the president and many of his senior people understand the grave nature of the threat China poses for America. Has China held up its end of the bargain? The most important thing is that we kept the tariffs in place. That made the agreement a success. In terms of the systemic changes, they've kept some and not others. They've done a number of things in agriculture. They did not make the promised purchases. So I think that would justify using that agreement as a way to raise additional tariffs on China. I think they are in violation of the agreement. In your book, you write that China is the chief adversary of the U.S. and the biggest threat to our way of life. Does that mean there should be even stronger measures put against them in terms of trade? I don't want to be transferring the wealth of the United States to China. I don't think that's in our interests. And we don't want to have them run these big trade surpluses as the economic element of their geopolitical strategy. Their strategy is to become the dominant power in the world. Their strategy is to retake what they believe to be their rightful place in the world, where they believe they should be, and were for thousands of years. How realistic is it for the U.S. to rebalance these massive imbalances when the country has already lost a significant portion of its manufacturing base, and labor and other inputs have shifted elsewhere? Wouldn't it require an incredible number of tariffs or pushback against China and the entire global economic architecture? You would phase these in over a period of time, but of course, we can do it. It would probably mean more manufacturing in Mexico, much more manufacturing in the United States, which is the most important thing. But of course we can do it. And I suppose you would oppose removing the China tariffs now in place. That would be essentially the same as surrender. It would be terrible. On the issue of Taiwan, is it true that while you were in office you opposed a trade deal with Taiwan? That is true. I defer to others on what our overall policy should be toward Taiwan. But in trade, Taiwan has treated the U.S. unfairly and they continuously run large surpluses with us. They keep our agricultural products out of their market in many cases. And I saw no reason to do a free trade agreement with a country who ought to give us better access and get back to balanced trade without us making additional concessions to them. And what's your sense of the Biden administration? The way they have handled trade policy since you've left office? There are some people in the Biden administration who understand it and get it, and some who don't. They have continued the Trump policies in many cases, including the tariffs. They had continued and expanded on the policies of export controls, which is important. They just did a little nod in the direction of some kind of investment control. But I do not believe the president and many of his senior people understand the grave nature of the threat China poses for America. But haven't they been surprisingly tough on economic and other sanctions, particularly coming out of the Commerce Department, and begun engaging in some type of strategic decoupling, which is what you advocate? They say they don't want to decouple. Their policy is to protect our technology with a small yard and high fence. And they want de-risking. They have this whole notion of sort of half measures, so, no, they have not. How much corporate lobbying pressure, if any, did you face while serving as U.S. Trade Representative? There are businesses out there, and they're all lobbying. They're all spending money and trying to do what will raise their profits and pay more money to their senior executives. That's what they do. Executives do it because they want to get richer and corporations want to take care of the shareholders, so they're all spending money either to maintain the status quo or to find an edge. So for sure, the Chamber of Commerce and the other big business groups were lobbying. They were concerned about making money, and that's fine. But the purpose of policymakers is to make policies that help the country. We can't expect business people to do that. It's not their primary goal. Many of them think what they do helps the country, and I think that's true in many cases, but their objective is not what's good for the American worker or the American middle class. Their objective is what's good for their own shareholders in their own fiscal situation. So that is an issue. It's a business community that has largely lined up against the interests of American workers. In your book, you were pretty favorable to President Trump. Do you favor a second Trump administration to carry out the proposals you cite in your book? The purpose of writing this book was to try to influence policy with Republicans and Democrats, whoever gets in. I want members of Congress as well as the chief executive to read it and understand the nature of the problems. This is not a partisan book or a campaign book. The book is about policy and history and trying to help America. Matthew Pottinger on flipping the U.S.-China paradigm on its head. A key figure in the Trump administration, the former reporter and Marine talks about the reality of the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions, the value of concrete actions versus rhetoric, how she was flummoxed by Trump, and why the CCP just can't help itself. Matt Pottinger played a crucial, behind-the-scenes role in the Trump administration's break with decades of bipartisan agreement about engagement with China. Pottinger felt that U.S. leaders had deluded themselves into thinking that wrapping China more tightly into the U.S. economic orbit would change the way Beijing governed. He came to these views in an unusual way for a China policymaker. He began his career as a journalist in China for Reuters and the Wall Street Journal. We overlapped at the Journal but didn't work together on stories. After the September 11th terrorist attacks, he enlisted in the Marines at age 31 and worked in Afghanistan for General Michael Flynn, who later became President Trump's first national security advisor and recruited Pottinger to be his Asia chief at the National Security Council. Pottinger became a skilled bureaucratic operator. He outlasted 3 Trump national security advisors and was ultimately named Deputy National Security Advisor. He resigned on January 6, 2021 when the Capitol was stormed by protesters. This interview is part of Rules of Engagement, a new series by Bob Davis, who covered the U.S.-China relationship at the Wall Street Journal starting in the 1990s. In these interviews, Davis asks current and former U.S. officials and policymakers what went right, what went wrong, and what comes next. Question: You have an unusual resume for a China policy person. Why were you interested in China and how did you pursue your interests? A. I became interested in China as a high school student in the mid and late 1980s. I studied Chinese language and I had planned on attending a summer exchange program that would have put me in a Chinese school not far from Tiananmen Square. Days before we were supposed to leave for China, the Tiananmen massacre took place in 1989. Our trip was canceled, but that event was fateful for me personally. It's the thing that got me interested in current events. I began reading the news every day, and it got me interested in both journalism and in China. I didn't make it to China until 4 years later when I was a college student, one majoring in East Asian languages and literature and also studying history. I spent a year as an exchange student during college in Beijing, and then I spent a year in Taiwan, right after college. From there, I joined the Reuters news agency to cover Beijing. Early in my career as a journalist in China, when I was writing for Reuters, I covered the negotiations to bring China into the WTO. I was among those who were optimistic that this would unleash not just economic growth, but reforms that would further liberalize the Chinese economy. It was an optimistic time to be in China working as a reporter. In the late 1990s, you had a huge migration of talented people from the countryside to major cities like Beijing. It was the beginning of the telecoms and internet revolution. Plus, a lot more Chinese students were going abroad, and some of them were coming back to work for foreign multinational companies. As time went on, it began to sink in that the big assumption that we had all made that China would liberalize may have been misplaced. Some of the stories that I reported on probably accelerated that viewpoint for me. I covered a lot of stories about corruption in China. Most of the corruption I saw was a feature of a communist single-party system which had no rule of law and no independent press. And I had run-ins with the Chinese security apparatus, both times while covering corruption stories. One related to China's yellowcake production for its nuclear program. The other was a perennial story about how local party officials were forcing farmers off their land in order to sell it to other party officials to build up industry and goose China's GDP figures. I got to meet a lot of people whose lives were destroyed. Then there was the SARS epidemic in late 2002, early 2003. I was one of the lead reporters covering that epidemic, and I learned a lot about how the party operates. It was the nature of the single-party Leninist system to cover up an epidemic that luckily ended up petering out. It was a prototype for the highly destructive pandemic we would see 17 years later. The stories I covered forced me to revisit some of the more optimistic assumptions that I made earlier in my career. From there, you went into the military and then, as I understand it, you did research on China for a hedge fund. I founded my own company first, which was an investigative, due diligence firm, called China 6, LLC. I had a small team that was doing on-the-ground research in China on behalf of American investment firms to help them understand what was really going on with some of the companies they were considering investing in. One of the companies that I investigated ended up getting kicked off the New York Stock Exchange. After doing that for a few years, one of my clients, a multi-strategy hedge fund, Davidson Kempner Capital Management, in New York, brought me on board to do investigative research for them, not just on China, but around the world. I worked there for a few years until I was unexpectedly invited to come work at the White House after the 2016 election. You were recruited by General Mike Flynn. You had worked with him in Afghanistan. He comes off now as a conspiracist. What was he like at that point? After the 2016 election, I was invited to brief the transition team by General Mike Flynn, who I had worked closely with in 2009 to 10 in Afghanistan, as well as by his incoming Deputy National Security Advisor, K.T. McFarland, who was a friend from New York. Mike Flynn was a very effective wartime intelligence officer who was iconoclastic. He was someone who was willing to radically change the ways we were fighting and the ways in which we were conducting intelligence operations and analysis when he saw that those operations and ways of doing business were failing. He was not someone who was seeking promotions. He was someone who was very much focused on winning the war. He gave an enormous amount of leeway to his subordinates, myself included, to be imaginative in trying to troubleshoot and fix systems that were not helping us win our fight against the Taliban and other terrorist organizations. So I had a very good collaboration with him in 2009 and 2010. Coming into the White House, what was your view of the fairly bipartisan approach prior administrations had taken towards China, which prized engagement? I was a firm believer that our policy consensus, which had persisted since soon after the end of the Cold War, had failed, and that we were on the wrong track. It was never going to achieve what it set out to achieve, which was fundamentally the remaking of China. I thought that we were behaving as though we were blind and deaf to the reality of the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions. I wrote a 12-page paper for the transition team after Trump was elected, laying out what I thought our policy direction should look like. And I laid out what constituted a paradigm shift. I had heard President-elect Trump's rhetoric that our policy was a failure and that the Chinese Communist Party was taking advantage of the United States. And so I thought it was conceivable that his general attitude about China might sync with some of my ideas. That paper became the basis for my being invited to work at the White House. In many respects, it became the basis for our Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, which was a strategy document that we completed in the first year of the Trump administration. It was declassified at the very end of the Trump administration. What did you think the paradigm was and what needed to be shifted? The most important assumption that had underlined a quarter-century of our policy towards China was the idea that through trade we could liberalize not only China's economy, but its society and even its politics. That comes through in the speeches of President Bill Clinton, and in the speeches of senior members of the Bush administration, including Bob Zoellick. Point 2, it also came through in some of the rhetoric and policy documents of the Obama administration. It was the idea that through engagement we could change China and reassure China that we are not a threat. The evidence, though, really mounted over the course of those 25 years that China would, in fact, work very hard to subvert U.S. power and influence, first within China, then regionally, and then globally. I thought that we were behaving as though we were blind and deaf to the reality of the Chinese Communist Party's ambitions, its hostility to the end state that we were trying to achieve, and its resourcefulness in working to achieve its ambitions globally. So you came into the White House under a president whose anti-China views were a big part of the campaign, and who thought that the U.S. was getting played by the Chinese, economically. But it's also fair to say he didn't know much about the specifics and was doubtful of alliances. And obviously there was a lot of concern about Trump as a personality. I didn't know what to expect. President-elect Trump during the transition was just trying to put together a team. Every presidential transition is pretty chaotic in some respects, certainly frenetic. Mentors of mine strongly urged me to go into the administration. I come from a tradition that when a president of the United States asks for your service, you salute and render service. I had served as a commissioned officer in the military under Presidents Bush and Obama. In ways that I think are still poorly understood by outside observers, the dynamic that emerged was one in which there was a kind of good cop, bad cop routine. It played out against our adversaries, but it also applied to some of our allies that were not carrying their weight. In the case of our state adversaries, all of whom are run by dictators, President Trump's approach was to maintain a respectful line of communication. In that kind of system, he believed the only person who can make decisions is the dictator himself, and not the mid-level foreign ministry officials below him. At the same time that President Trump would maintain a respectful open channel with dictators, he approved plans by his government to apply increasing pressure, both economic and military, against those same dictators' regimes. That was certainly true of North Korea. We really flipped the paradigm on its head. The paradigm for a quarter century had been for mid-level State Department officials to have years of dialogue with mid-level regime officials, who would ultimately make some kind of a promise in exchange for us reducing concrete pressure on their economies. And every time we would get egg on our face. The regime would not make good on its promises, yet we had just reduced economic pressure in a way that allowed them to grow their economies and their spending on nuclear weapons and other military programs. We took the opposite approach over the course of 2017. Former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley got 4 UN Security Council resolutions through which massively increased economic constraints on North Korea and did so with the support of the People's Republic of China and other members. We had this strange paradox, starting in 2018, of an increasingly warm channel between the two leaders alongside increasingly tight economic sanctions. That's a much better pattern than the inverse, where we don't talk at all at the leader level, but we have soft, half-assed sanctions applied towards that regime. The same was true of Russia, where President Trump made all sorts of sometimes flattering statements about Vladimir Putin. At the same time, his administration did things that were much tougher against the Russian regime than the Obama administration, such as selling lethal weapons for the first time to Ukraine. If you look at the concrete record of what we did, we were much, much tougher on Russia than the Obama administration had been, except rhetorically at the leader level. It's kind of an interesting paradox. In my view, it was much more effective. But the way it came across was that Trump was entranced with dictators and not engaged with the details. You have to zoom out, because the people who were most entranced were the media, who could not see beyond that dynamic. Of course, a lot of Americans, at a minimum, were scratching their heads too. If you look at what our government was actually doing to the Russians, you have a much more effective foreign policy in aggregate than we had pursued before. Previously you had moralizing and virtue posturing by American leaders but a wimpy approach when it came to where the rubber meets the road. The same is true of China. President Trump spoke frequently with Xi Jinping. He put a lot of time into his personal diplomacy on the phone, in letter writing and in-person meetings. But our policy was a radical departure from the past. We weren't trying to continue a level steady flight of engagement and letting our market and intellectual property be exploited by China. In fact, we started to impose tariffs and other remedies and costs on China, not only in the trade space but in the diplomatic realm, in terms of combating malign influence and espionage activities inside our borders. There's a massive range of activities that we undertook, which in large part have been continued by the Biden administration. What was it like being blindsided by Trump's tweets? I had more than one instance where I'd be meeting with foreign diplomats who would mention a tweet by the president that I hadn't yet seen. I started a system of having my staff print out and run tweets to me that touched on foreign policy issues so I wouldn't be blindsided. It was one of President Trump's idiosyncrasies that he used Twitter to communicate directly with the American people and with foreign counterparts. And with his own government, frankly. It was a challenge, but it was sometimes quite effective. For example, if President Trump was tweeting a warning to the Ayatollah, that carried a lot more weight than if it had just been a phone call from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to his rough counterpart in the Iranian military. You were at Trump's meeting in Buenos Aires with Xi Jinping in December 2018, when the administration was about to impose tariffs on China. What did you make of Xi? By that point, Xi had been in power for 6 years or so. He had consolidated power to such an extent that he was beginning to be much more unguarded about his true intentions, and I think that came through. The fig leaf of China's hide-and-bide strategy, referring to Deng Xiaoping's dictum of hide your capacities, bide your time, had really blown away. It was no coincidence that he had by that point revised China's constitution to allow him to be the only person who was no longer constrained by term limits. I think we know an enormous deal about Xi's grandiose ambitions and how global in scope they are, and how antagonistic they are to everything we hold dear in the West. He would come very well prepared, having memorized his talking points. We know that because sometimes what he was saying matched perfectly with what his translator was reading, even though she didn't have notes in front of him. He was trying to figure out how to manipulate, through flattery or other means, his way to a policy that would serve his interest. He was largely flummoxed by President Trump. Every time he thought that he had figured him out and was on the verge of getting him to back off on tariffs, for example, President Trump would surprise him by sticking with those tariffs, or in some cases increasing them. As the late, great Jim Lilly, U.S. ambassador to China from 1989 to 1991, used to say, the Chinese playbook is to flatter their way to what they want, and when that doesn't work, to threaten their way towards what they want. And when that doesn't work, they're flummoxed. I think that's where Xi Jinping ended up over the course of the Trump administration. He did not achieve what he hoped to achieve, and was not able to flatter his way to getting the United States to back off. Their playbook began to fail them. We know a lot more about Xi now, those of us who pay attention to what he's been saying in speeches that are addressed to his internal audience, the Central Committee of the Communist Party. We know an enormous amount about his grandiose ambitions and how global in scope they are, and how antagonistic they are to everything we hold dear in the West. Did you see a difference in Xi from that Buenos Aires meeting in 2018 to the G20 meeting in Osaka in June 2019? Former Trump National Security Advisor John Bolton has said that was the meeting in which Trump effectively gave Xi the okay to go ahead with his harsh policies in Xinjiang. I don't recall President Trump talking about Xinjiang in a group meeting with Xi. To the extent that there was a difference with Xi at that meeting, it's because there was a difference in the dynamic generally from Argentina to Osaka. China was trying to get us to back down from the tariffs. President Trump was trying to get to an agreement. The meeting sustained the dialogue that was taking place. That was the final meeting between the two leaders and the one that ultimately got them to the Phase 1 trade agreement. Also, once President Trump and our administration had held substantive talks with North Korea, China was no longer willing to support U.S. efforts to constrain Pyongyang. I think that dynamic will continue. The more we talk to North Korea, the less China will be supportive of our diplomacy. China wants to keep that situation boiling. They don't want the U.S. to develop too good a relationship with North Korea. If things become really bad between the U.S. and North Korea, China will work to support U.S. sanctions and policy designed to constrain North Korea. You spent a lot of time trying to convince countries not to take Chinese 5G technology. Do you think your effort was a success? The goal was to prevent Huawei from taking control of the networks of our allies and fellow democracies through a mix of heavy subsidies and a decades-old pattern of theft of IP, intellectual property. Huawei had built itself into a formidable equipment supplier that had the benefit of financing and subsidies by the Chinese government for the sale of their equipment to governments and telecoms operators around the world. The real protagonist in this big decoupling story, especially tech decoupling, is Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. The United Kingdom, for example, was unwilling to prevent Huawei from becoming a major supplier to British Telecom for 5G telecommunications equipment in spite of the fact that we had all sorts of evidence showing that they were not a trusted provider. London was reluctant to bar Huawei, largely because it was selling its equipment at such a steep discount to British Telecom. What we ultimately did was put in place export controls, including a rather radical measure called the Foreign Direct Product Rule that basically banned companies anywhere in the world from selling chips to Huawei if those chips were made with American technology. That undermined Huawei's ability to continue manufacturing 5G equipment at a sufficient level to serve all these markets, including the United Kingdom. That step was extremely effective even though it was criticized by a lot of people at the time. It was a decisive action that led the United Kingdom to ban Huawei from bidding for 5G network contracts. Ultimately, it led to what is known as a rip and replace policy even for 4G network equipment. Editor note: rip and replace means ripping out Huawei equipment and replacing it with equipment from other vendors. And that spread to other countries as well. Australia was the earliest, Japan followed, then India and many Western European countries. Now Huawei has found a way to sidestep those export controls by simply setting up an alternative company under a different name. And the Commerce Department hasn't bothered to keep track with that rather predictable and rudimentary step. Do you think U.S. policy ought to be to try to kill Huawei as a company? The policy is not about killing Huawei. It's about imposing measures that will prevent Huawei from dominating the entire global IT, information technology, infrastructure, which was their goal. Actually, they were making pretty good progress towards achieving that goal. So it's not enough to run faster at home and in the free world, although that's one of the things we need to do. We need to ensure that there are viable alternatives to Huawei and that there are incentives for those companies to innovate and grow and compete. But at the same time, we have to constrain Huawei. That's what China has been doing. China does not allow foreign equipment makers to have more than a tiny sliver of the Chinese telecoms equipment market. We should return the favor and block Huawei from Western markets. We need to ensure that trusted Western suppliers can compete at home and in third markets. This is a form of decoupling that is driven by the Chinese side. We're merely catching up in a reactive way. The real protagonist in this big decoupling story, especially tech decoupling, is Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. We got off the subject of human rights. My impression was that the people in the national security part of the Trump administration wanted to push harder on Xinjiang and on Taiwan and were frustrated. For Trump, that wasn't a priority. How did you try to deal with that? This is another case where the administration's actions are different from the president's rhetoric. In the end, President Trump was the only Western leader to impose sanctions on China for its human rights atrocities in Xinjiang. He was the only leader in the world to impose import bans on goods manufactured in Xinjiang, including the creepy crates filled with tons of human hair that China sent from Xinjiang to a U.S. port for making hair weaves and wigs in the United States. These weren't things that were done behind President Trump's back. These were things that President Trump blessed. This is one of those cases where the president's rhetoric on human rights often left much to be desired. But his actions were far more formidable than those of, say, former German leader Angela Merkel, who liked to talk about human rights but didn't do one bloody thing to account for the genocide and crimes against humanity taking place in Xinjiang. No other Western leader did a thing, except for President Trump. So, again, you have to zoom back and balance the rhetoric against the actions. Yes, it's idiosyncratic, sometimes it's contradictory, but ultimately President Trump agreed to those measures. Are you saying that President Trump was misunderstood? The way it's looked is that he would reluctantly go ahead with some of the proposals that he didn't really care a hell of a lot about. Sometimes it took some effort to persuade him of a certain track. Other times he had no trouble understanding the logic of a particular move. If it's between a president who will posture on moral grounds against human rights atrocities, but not do anything about them on the one hand, or a president who's not all that interested in lecturing foreign countries, but does take concrete steps designed to impose costs for those human rights atrocities, I will choose the latter. Although what I'd really love is one that speaks out in an impassioned way about universal values and human dignity and takes action on them. Now, to the extent President Trump is misunderstood, one area is that he was heavily affected by atrocities when confronted with evidence of them. Former National Security Advisor General H.R. McMaster will tell you about the conversations he had with President Trump when the evidence of children murdered by chemical weapons in Syria was presented. He was deeply, deeply affected. When President Trump would go to receive the bodies of American servicemen and women who fell in combat, and he traveled to Dover Air Force many times, he was deeply affected. Let's talk about the impact of COVID and the pandemic on U.S.-China relations. Let me play devil's advocate. If U.S.-China relations hadn't been so corroded at that point, could the two countries have worked together? I wonder whether historians will look back at that episode and say that marked the end of engagement. I think 2020 was the watershed. In 2017, we crafted our national security strategy, national defense strategy, and our Indo-Pacific strategic framework, which was really a China strategy as well as a still classified strategy called Countering Chinese Economic Aggression. Those four strategies laid out the policy case for the end of what is broadly termed engagement, not a literal end to engagement because it is going to be part of our relations with every country, but the end of the emphasis on engagement as part of the paradigm shift towards an emphasis on competition. Those documents were very sharp departures from their predecessor documents. But when it comes to seeing that paradigm shift, the move from theory to practical application, 2020 and the COVID crisis were the catalyst for those policies being put into action in a significant way. About a year before the COVID pandemic, I worked to try to find areas of common ground with the Chinese government. I was in favor of us having and trying to deepen dialogue. One of those areas was pandemic prevention. This was something I put in writing to the Chinese government and had conversations with the Chinese government about. This was 2018, 2019. One area that would have shown good faith on pandemic prevention and global health cooperation would have been if the People's Republic of China had been willing to live up to its promises to the World Health Organization. Under the terms of their membership, they were obligated to share samples of flu virus, including avian flu virus, when those samples were collected. China was unwilling to share about a dozen different collected samples of new flu strains that had the potential to become pandemics and were potential threats to human health. This is before COVID. I had learned from the CDC, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Health and Human Services, and the State Department that China was unwilling to fulfill its obligation under the WHO to simply share samples of dangerous new strains of flu. I said, to the Chinese, this is a time when we've got a difficult trade relationship, a time when all Americans are reassessing our ties with China. This is an area where we can work together and we're willing to work together. And the first step is that you simply live up to those obligations so that we can share samples the way that we always do. We have to stop kidding ourselves that we can turn a great white shark into a bottlenose dolphin by treating it sweetly. And the answer was not only no, it was a little bit worse. It was clear that China wanted to use that as leverage to achieve its goals in other policy areas that had nothing to do with human health, like the South China Sea or Operation Fox Hunt, where they were sending Chinese security goons to enforce the rendition of people inside U.S. territory. Sharing samples was something where their approach was, maybe we would consider that if the U.S. would allow us to get our way in other areas that would violate international law or U.S. sovereignty. Here you have, in a grain of sand, the nature of a Leninist one-party system. It cannot help itself. There is no such thing as, let's compartmentalize our differences and talk in a different channel about how we work towards the common good of our citizens' public health. That is not how a Leninist single-party state system operates, and it never will. We have to stop kidding ourselves that we can turn a great white shark into a bottlenose dolphin by treating it sweetly. It's not going to behave like a bottlenose dolphin. It is a shark. Therefore, you have to constrain the shark's activity. It doesn't mean that you kill the shark. It doesn't mean that we cannot coexist. What it does mean is that we have to coexist with damn good barriers and fences. You were one of the people in the administration looking into the idea that the release of COVID might have come from a Wuhan laboratory, either on purpose or by error. My impression is that the latest research is that it was probably transferred from an animal like a bat to human. What's your view now? The truth is, we don't know. It's clear that a lot of very thoughtful scientists, as well as some members of the intelligence community in the United States, believe that it is very much possible that this accidentally leaked out of a laboratory. And given that the natural zoonotic event is also a viable possibility, we should probably already be taking steps designed to mitigate against either a lab release or animal-to-human transmission. I haven't seen any evidence that the U.S. or any other countries have taken a leadership role in mitigating against either possibility. How is it that the Chinese Communist Party can track the communications and activity and spending habits of 1.3 billion people, but somehow it's just too tough a nut to crack to prevent wild animals from being brought into urban centers where they could potentially extinguish significant portions of our species? Isn't that stunning? When you have 1 million dead Americans, at least, and millions of others who perished around the world, and you've got long COVID and all the economic consequences, that we haven't taken steps to mitigate against either possibility? We should be taking the lead and taking a much closer look at what types of gain-of-function research should be considered legitimate, and which are probably not worth the risk. Editor note: gain-of-function refers to medical research that genetically alters an organism so that it enhances biological functions. We should also be taking steps to eliminate the wild animals market trade in China. How many times do we have to learn this lesson? How is it that the Chinese Communist Party can track the communications and activity and spending habits of 1.3 billion people, but somehow it's just too tough a nut to crack to prevent wild animals from being brought into urban centers where they could potentially extinguish significant portions of our species? That is madness. Why do you think that Xi Jinping is so locked into the zero-COVID idea? We don't know for certain, but we have some good leads. One is that we have heard from very high levels of the Standing Committee of the Politburo the idea that China's ability to keep COVID out of its country is a direct expression of the superiority of their totalitarian single-party system. We saw one member of the Communist Party talk about the idea that the effects of COVID had been similar to the effects of World War II, with China performing better in relative terms and therefore having benefited from this global pandemic. I think that they, and she personally, are wedded to the idea that this is an expression of the superiority of their system and the inferiority of democratic systems. Number two is that there could be real political costs to Xi Jinping if this virus is permitted to spread, and it leads to a lot of elderly people suffering and dying. Even though China is a single-party Leninist system, it is still also a Confucian society that has special reverence for the elderly. The third factor is that in a dictatorship, especially when a dictator has been in power for a decade, the quality of information flow deteriorates because people become increasingly fearful of saying things that they don't think will please the ear of the emperor. Also, the emperor surrounds himself with more and more loyalists. He's getting worse and worse information about what steps China would need to take to manage their economy while also managing COVID. They failed to permit foreign mRNA vaccines, even though they had the opportunity to do so in the spring of 2020. That was when Fosun Pharma achieved an MOU with BioNTech, which makes the BioNTech-Pfizer mRNA vaccine. They had an agreement to allow for manufacturing and distribution. The Chinese government never allowed that to move forward. That is a classic sort of misjudgment by an underinformed dictatorship. At the end of the Trump administration, you tried to put together an economic NATO of sorts where allies would step in to buy imports that China bans for political reasons. That didn't go anywhere. What do you think should be done? It's really in two areas: technology flows and capital flows. The Trump administration fashioned new tools for dealing with the outbound flow of U.S. capital and technology that aids China's military advancement and which aids the advancement of China's surveillance apparatus against its own people and which it exports to other autocracies. These tools were reaffirmed in executive orders under the Biden administration, but to date they are not really being used. One example is that President Trump signed 2 executive orders in his final months in office designed to prevent Americans from investing in Chinese companies that are advancing China's military modernization. President Biden rewrote a new executive order that maintained the so-called blacklist, but it moved the stewardship of that blacklist from the Pentagon to the Department of the Treasury. The Treasury has shown it has no stomach to actually grow that blacklist significantly. It also doesn't have the stomach to enforce that blacklist with the same strength the Trump administration's Treasury Department had shown. I'll give you an example. The Trump administration's Treasury Department wrote an FAQ in which they explained the details of an executive order that companies would have to divest from Chinese military companies within a year. The Biden administration? Just the other day, their Treasury Department dribbled out a little FAQ that said, if you already own Chinese military stocks, don't worry about it. You don't have to divest. Holy cow. I mean, what a bunch of wusses. The tools are there. The tools had been blessed by the Biden administration, just as they were by the Trump administration. The difference between the Trump and Biden administrations is that the Biden administration doesn't have the stomach to follow through and take the concrete steps they need to take to cut off the flow of American capital and American technology to those companies in China that would do the greatest harm to the United States. You resigned on January 6, 2021, but you never said why. Why did you resign? And if President Trump were to win election again, would you work for him? I have spoken in the past on record on why I left. Given the events of January 6th and the riot at the Capitol, I did not believe that I could remain in the administration. I'm going to remain out of government probably for a very long time, just given where I am with my family. I have 2 young boys, one of whom was born while I was in office. Anyone who's worked in these jobs can tell you that your life really isn't your own. I stayed for 4 years. I'm extremely proud of my service. I'm very proud of how the foreign policy came out, on balance. We achieved peace between 3 Sunni Arab states and Israel. That was quite a hat trick. We changed the trajectory of U.S.-China relations in ways that are going to make the United States safer and more viable over the long term. And President Biden has sustained a lot of that policy. We were right to contain Iran and to deprive it of the material resources that it needed to conduct terrorist activities and proxy wars around its region. Last question. Your dad knew who Deep Throat, the key source for the Washington Post stories about Watergate, was. Did he ever tell you? Were you surprised when it came out that your father knew? I knew that he knew. He never told me who it was, and I never pressed him on it. It was something that I really respected. If you read Bob Woodward's book, The Secret Man, about Mark Felt and Deep Throat, one of the chapters talks about the small number of people who knew. My father had figured it out, while taking a deposition from Mark Felt in a grand jury investigation. Based on Mark Felt's reaction to one of the questions, my father knew that he must be Deep Throat. He told Woodward but kept the secret for decades. Didn't that drive you crazy as a journalist? Wouldn't you want to know? I'm someone who's been both a journalist and someone who's been a keeper of secrets as a national security practitioner. I believe there are certain secrets that should be kept. I believe that sources should be protected by journalists and that sometimes the public doesn't have a right to know. I also think journalists have a responsibility to protect national security when their reporting could put innocent people in harm's way. It's a delicate balancing act, and I've been on both sides of that equation. The case for deterrence. Xi Jinping wants to invade Taiwan. The only way the U.S. can stop him is by changing his calculus. If just one lesson could be drawn from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it must be that deterrence would have been a lot cheaper than war. Yet democracies seem to be getting worse at deterrence. The record of the past few years is marred with failures and signs of trouble. In August 2021, the Taliban toppled the democratic government of Afghanistan just 6 weeks after watching the United States vacate its last major military base in the country. 6 months later, Vladimir Putin, unfazed by Washington's threats of sanctions, assaulted the capital of Ukraine and plunged Europe into its most destructive conflict since World War II. As that conflict raged, Iran equipped Hamas to initiate a war with Israel and, once the war had started, mobilized several other terrorist proxy groups to rocket Israel, attack commercial shipping in the Red Sea, target U.S. warships, and strike U.S. military positions in Iraq, Syria, and Jordan. North Korea has also been undaunted by either United Nations Security Council resolutions or American sanctions. Last year it resumed testing intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, for the first time in more than 5 years and became a supplier of arms and munitions for Russia's war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, in South America, Venezuela's dictator Nicolas Maduro appears to have concluded that Washington's bark is worse than its bite. He has threatened to annex much of Venezuela's oil-rich neighbor, Guyana. In a bold reprisal of Soviet mischief in the Americas during the Cold War, Beijing is expressing sympathy for Venezuela's position while also developing Chinese intelligence facilities and a plan for a military base on Cuba. But looming on the horizon is the specter of a conflict more consequential than all these flashpoints combined. Chinese Supreme Leader Xi Jinping has vowed to reunify Taiwan with mainland China through force of arms if necessary. Xi's public statements about a coming great struggle against China's enemies provide a window into his intentions, one the world would be unwise to ignore. More than once, Xi has described unification with Taiwan as a prerequisite for achieving his broader objectives for China on the world stage, a vision he calls the Chinese dream for the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In a 2017 address to the 19th Party Congress in Beijing, Xi said that complete national unification is an inevitable requirement for realizing the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. In 2019 in Beijing, at the meeting marking the 40th anniversary of the issuance of the message to compatriots in Taiwan, he said, "The rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and reunification of our country are a surging popular trend. It is where the greater national interest lies, and it is what the people desire." In October 2021, he delivered an address about Taiwan at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing in which he uttered the word rejuvenation more than 24 times. The implication is hard to miss. Xi is equating a failure to subsume Taiwan with a failure to enact his overarching goals as China's leader. Although Xi has been less concrete, at least in public, about a timeline, he has exhibited an impatience that distinguishes him from his predecessors. The issue of political disagreements that exist between the two sides must reach a final resolution, step by step, and these issues cannot be passed on from generation to generation, Xi told an envoy from Taiwan in October 2013. This and similar statements by Xi are a far cry from then paramount leader Deng Xiaoping's famous line, in 1984, that China could wait 1,000 years to unify with Taiwan if necessary. And whereas Xi's more immediate predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, framed war as something Beijing would wage in response to a declaration of independence by Taiwan, official propaganda under Xi has gone further by suggesting that force may be used to compel unification, not just to respond to a Taiwanese bid for formal independence. Xi seemed to confirm this in his face-to-face meeting with U.S. President Joe Biden in San Francisco in November 2023. According to a senior U.S. official who briefed reporters after the summit, Xi said his preference was for peaceful reunification but then moved immediately to conditions that the potential use of force could be utilized. When Biden responded by assuring Xi that Washington was determined to maintain peace in the region, Xi's response was blunt. Per the U.S. official, President Xi responded, "Look, peace is all well and good, but at some point we need to move toward resolution more generally." In other words, Xi appeared to elevate the goal of unification above the goal of peace. His tough signaling extended to China's official readout of the meeting, which quoted Xi as follows: "The United States should embody its stance of not supporting Taiwan independence in concrete actions, stop arming Taiwan, and support China's peaceful reunification. China will eventually be reunified and will inevitably be reunified." That may have been the first time Xi publicly called for U.S. support for unifying China and Taiwan. Such language marks a fundamental revision of Beijing's long-standing demand that Washington refrain from supporting Taiwan independence. Simply put, and contrary to the assumptions of many Western analysts, Xi's moves aren't aimed at maintaining the decades-old status quo in the Taiwan Strait but at ending it. Xi knows this may require war. In key speeches over the past few years, he has admonished his party and its armed wing, the People's Liberation Army, to prepare for a major conflict. In the face of major risks and strong opponents, to always want to live in peace and never once struggle is unrealistic, she said in his November 2021 speech to the 6th plenum of the 19th Party Congress in Beijing. All kinds of hostile forces will absolutely never let us smoothly achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Based on this, I have repeatedly stressed to the entire party that we must carry out a great struggle. In this seminal address, kept secret for 2 months before being published in a Chinese-language journal, where it was missed by Western journalists and many scholars, she praised then paramount leader Mao Zedong's decision to enter the Korean War in 1950. Facing the threat and provocation of the United States, Mao and his comrades made the brave decision to go to war, she said. As he put it, the party's Central Committee and Comrade Mao Zedong, with the strategic foresight of by starting with one punch, 100 punches will be avoided, and the determination and bravery of do not hesitate to ruin the country internally in order to build it anew, made the historical policy decision to resist America and aid Korea and protect the nation. The language shows she framing Mao's move as a preemptive attack to avoid what she called the dangerous situation of invaders camping at the gates. Xi's choice of words was surely meant to signal his own preparedness to wage war under analogous circumstances and, chillingly, his tolerance for risking national ruin as the price of victory over China's enemies. No matter how strong the enemy is, how difficult the road, or how severe the challenge, the party is always completely without fear, never retreats, does not fear sacrifice, and is undeterrable, he said. While the speech's description of the United States as an enemy was made in a historical context, she has more recently cast Washington as China's explicit, present-day adversary. Western countries headed by the United States have implemented containment from all directions, encirclement and suppression against us, which has brought unprecedented severe challenges to our country's development, she said in a March 2023 address. That address was one of 4 made by Xi that month in which he underscored the need to prepare for war. In the first of the addresses, to delegates of the National People's Congress on March 5, Xi said China must end its reliance on imports of grain and manufactured goods. In case we're short of either, the international market will not protect us, Xi declared. In a speech the following day, he urged his listeners to dare to fight, and be good at fighting. On March 8, he unveiled to an audience of generals a national defense education campaign to unite society behind the military, invoking as inspiration the Double Support Movement, a 1943 campaign for society-wide militarization. In the fourth speech, on March 13, Xi announced that the unification of the motherland was the essence of his Great Rejuvenation campaign, a formulation that exceeded even his previous statements calling unification a requirement for China's rejuvenation. In light of all this, the world should regard gravely Xi's exhortation, contained in his work report to the 20th Party Congress in October 2022, that the Chinese Communist Party must prepare to undergo the stormy seas of a major test. These statements, it is important to understand, weren't propaganda meant for Western ears. They were authoritative instructions delivered by Xi to the Chinese Communist Party. They are taken seriously by the country's governing apparatus. We should give them at least the same weight that analysts ascribe to leaked Oval Office conversations about war and peace. I have singled out Xi Jinping personally as the object of deterrence, and for good reason. After more than a decade of consolidation and centralization of power, no other decision-maker counts nearly so much as Xi when it comes to questions of war and peace. His personal assumptions about China's chances in a conflict, and about the intentions and capabilities of Taiwan and the United States and its allies, are key variables in forming his calculus on whether to wage war. As the Australian strategist Ross Babbage reminds us, deterrence involves using one's actions to deliver the strongest possible psychological impact on the opposing decision-making elite so as to persuade them to desist, delay, or otherwise alter their operations to one's advantage. In today's China, the decision-making elite more or less boils down to one man: the stakes. It is tempting to imagine that the ripple effects from Beijing subjugating Taiwan could be contained, especially if the island were coercively annexed without a wider and highly destructive war. After all, There were dire predictions in the 1960s and 1970s about what a U.S. loss in Vietnam would spell for the future of Asia and for American power in the region, predictions that never came to pass. Domino theory didn't play out and communism didn't spread from Indochina. In the decades after Saigon fell in the spring of 1975, U.S. economic and political influence actually grew in Asia, even as Washington's military footprint decreased in the region. But this is the wrong analogy. A more apt precedent would be Imperial Japan's aggression and brief domination of the Asia-Pacific in the first half of the 1940s as Tokyo foisted its Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere upon hundreds of millions of unwilling subjects. Xi Jinping, in a landmark speech in Shanghai in 2014, even declared, "It is for the people of Asia to run the affairs of Asia, solve the problems of Asia, and uphold the security of Asia," a formulation eerily similar to the Asia for Asians slogan Tokyo adopted in 1940 when it set out to impose its concept of a self-contained, regional economic and security bloc controlled by Japan. The subjugation of the island nation by Beijing would have profound ramifications for geopolitics, trade, nuclear proliferation, and technology. Taipei's fall would represent much more than a mere Vietnam-style unification. It would herald the dawn of a new empire, one that would suit Beijing's brand of muscular authoritarianism and strongly disfavor the interests of the United States and its fellow democracies. The coercive annexation of Taiwan, even in the absence of an American intervention, would not alleviate Sino-American tensions but would supercharge them. This is why Taiwan's partners need to be clear-eyed about what would be required of them to break a Chinese blockade or repel an invasion. What the American people would sacrifice to win a Taiwan war would be far greater than the indirect support they have, to date, provided to Ukraine. There is simply no realistic hope that Taiwan can hold out for long against China without America committing directly to the fight. If America's support for Ukraine today is analogous to its indirect support for the United Kingdom and other allies through its Lend-Lease program in 1941, U.S. support for Taiwan amid a Chinese attack would be more akin to its direct participation in the 1950-53 Korean War. This makes preventing war all the more desirable and important. I believe that Xi Jinping, contrary to his declaration that the Chinese Communist Party is undeterrable, can be persuaded that a decision to wage war over Taiwan would be a grave miscalculation. He has demonstrated an appetite for risk, but his record isn't that of a reckless gambler. But in order to deter Xi, the United States and its allies need to pursue several urgent but practical military steps over the next 24 months. This isn't because economic, financial, informational, and diplomatic tools are unimportant when trying to dissuade adversaries. It's because they have little chance of succeeding in the absence of credible hard power, the sine qua non for effective deterrence. Deterrence in action. China may be physically close to Taiwan, but geography offers asymmetric advantages for Taiwan too. Taiwan's mountainous coastline, poor landing beaches, and urban sprawl present foreboding challenges for an invader. A favored metaphor in Taiwan is that it should adopt the strategy of a porcupine, making itself unappetizing or, if that fails, fatal to a hungry predator. But the real blessing for Taiwan is the strait that separates it from China. The Han Dynasty statesman Kwai Tong advised that even a powerful army should refrain from attacking well-defended border cities protected by metal ramparts and boiling moats. Taiwan, the United States, and key U.S. allies should embrace a boiling moat strategy. The Chinese military's center of gravity in a Taiwan war would be its navy. The Taiwan Strait would be its graveyard. To do this, however, democracies must increase their defense spending sharply to keep key legacy systems working and to scale up the production of munitions. This is because, if we do succeed at deterring Xi for the remainder of the 2020s, it will be thanks largely to legacy military systems, not futuristic programs that have yet to bear fruit. The U.S. must marshal technologies and weapons systems that, for the most part, already exist in the arsenals of the United States and its partners or have been developed and tested and are eligible for production and procurement. As General Christopher G. Cavalli, America's senior military officer in Europe, told me, one of the lessons of the Ukraine war is that kinetic effects are what determine results, and the majority of kinetic effects are from legacy systems. So don't sunset legacy systems prematurely while awaiting the sunrise of next-generation capabilities. Otherwise, we'll be left stranded at midnight. Taiwan and its partners must also have enough munitions not only to deny Beijing a speedy victory but also to continue fighting in case she chooses to wage a protracted war. At present, democracies may lack sufficient munitions for either scenario. The pre-existence of industrial capacity for making these weapons will be a crucial element of effective deterrence. One silver lining is that in war, time tends to be a better friend to the defender than to the aggressor. An offensive war requires above all a quick, irresistible decision, the Prussian strategist Karl von Clausewitz wrote in his classic on war. Any kind of interruption, pause, or suspension of activity is inconsistent with the nature of offensive war. If Beijing stumbles in its initial onslaught, Taiwan will have a much better chance at winning a conflict. It would be a shame for Taiwan to make it that far only to fail in a follow-on, protracted phase of war because democracies didn't have the foresight to invest enough in military manufacturing. Admiral Yoji Koda, a former commander of the Japanese fleet, told me that Americans often consider the June 1942 Battle of Midway to be the decisive naval engagement of World War II. Japanese military historians don't all see it that way, he said. Rather, it was the months of sea battles that followed, many of them without names, during which the U.S. Armed Forces decisively wore down the Imperial Japanese Navy thanks to superior production of ships, munitions, aircraft, and incremental technologies, such as those that gave the Americans an edge in nighttime combat. This War of the Destroyers, as Koda calls it, was more costly to Japan than the Battle of Midway. The United States and Japan, now great allies, should be aiming together for a capacity to win wars, not just battles. China's vulnerabilities, after all, are many. Beijing may control the world's largest navy, but its surface vessels, without which it cannot secure military control of Taiwan, would be ripe targets in a war not only for American attack submarines, but for U.S. heavy bombers that can reach the western Pacific in hours and launch fusillades of anti-ship missiles from a relatively safe distance. This is why the U.S. Air Force should also prepare for a more central role in a Taiwan contingency than its current priorities suggest. China may have a large arsenal of anti-ship ballistic missiles to keep U.S. aircraft carriers at bay, but Washington has formidable allies in the region that could help thwart Beijing's war aims if they joined an effort to defend Taiwan. This is why Tokyo should publicly embrace the near inevitability that it would be compelled to fight in the event China attacks Taiwan. A clear statement of intentions by Japan now, in peacetime, would reduce the odds of a war by helping to dispel wishful thinking in Beijing that Tokyo would remain passive. If we can deter a Taiwan war through the end of this decade, then newer weapons systems may enter democratic arsenals that can, if we play our cards wisely, deepen the allied offset of China's growing military juggernaut. But long-term deterrence won't be achieved haphazardly as a byproduct of other defense objectives. It will be achieved when it is the primary goal. A long and sorry tradition of underestimating Beijing's capabilities and intentions is giving way to sober new analyses in Taipei, Tokyo, Canberra, and Honolulu, home to the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command. In Washington, the bromide that war isn't in Beijing's interest is finally, if slowly, beginning to subside. But the often parochial and ill-coordinated defense budgets requested by allied military services and voted on by our legislatures leave the impression that deterrence is at best a secondary objective, something leaders evidently hope to achieve by accident or on the cheap. This thinking must change, and fast. The U.S. military has a smaller active duty force today than at any time since the early stages of World War II. The U.S. defense budget, adjusted for inflation, is shrinking at a time when wars are proliferating. As a percentage of GDP, U.S. annual defense spending today, at 3.1%, is less than half what it was at the peak of the Reagan administration, 6.8%, which presided over the most decisive decade of the Cold War without the need for a direct conflict with the Soviet Union. These statistics suggest Washington is forgetting the hardest lessons of the 20th century, the ones that were written in blood. A new arsenal of democracy. On October 19, 2023, at a moment when Israel was fighting on multiple fronts, U.S. forces and Iranian proxies were exchanging fire in Syria and Iraq, Ukraine was approaching the 2-year mark of its war for national survival, and North Korea was funneling arms and munitions into Putin's war machine, President Biden summarized the stakes in a sobering Oval Office address. We're facing an inflection point in history, one of those moments where the decisions we make today are going to determine the future for decades to come, he said in his opening line. Biden made no mention of China in the speech. Yet Beijing serves as a propaganda engine for, and the primary economic and diplomatic sponsor of, the revanchist autocracies that Biden did single out in his address, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. While Beijing often hides the extent of its support for Moscow, Tehran, and Pyongyang, the fig leaf is slipping away. The aims and actions of these four regimes are increasingly interrelated, as exemplified by Xi's no-limits pact with Putin on the eve of Russia's 2022 re-invasion of Ukraine, and by Moscow and Beijing hosting leaders from the terrorist group Hamas in the wake of its massacre of more than 1,200 Israelis on October 7, 2023. U.S. Secretary of State Tony Blinken in April visited Beijing and declared China was overwhelmingly the #1 supplier of Russia's war machine, and expressed doubts that Putin could have sustained the war this long without the material support from Xi Jinping. Whether Xi is acting opportunistically or according to a grand design, or, more likely, both, it is clear he sees advantage in the compounding crises on multiple continents, crises that run the risk of exhausting the United States and its allies and setting the table for a possible move on Taiwan. Indeed, Xi has made statements over the past few years that suggest he would agree with Biden that the world has reached a historic inflection point. The difference is that, from Xi's perspective, this is good news. Since the most recent period, the most important characteristic of the world is, in a word, chaos, and this trend appears likely to continue, Xi told a seminar of high-level officials in January 2021. Xi made clear that this was a useful development. The times and trends are on our side, Xi continued. Overall, the opportunities outweigh the challenges. Official texts make clear that this is a moment Xi has been long preparing for. A 2018 military textbook on Xi Jinping thought, stamped internal use only, states the following. The world is now undergoing a transition so massive that nothing like it has ever been seen before. At its core, this transition is being driven by the following changes. The United States is becoming weak. China is becoming strong. Russia is becoming aggressive. And Europe is becoming chaotic. The Chinese nation-state is rising and the Chinese ethnos is resurgent. This is an historic turning point. Xi has since cast himself not just as a beneficiary of the current situation but as an architect. In March 2023, more than a year into Russia's full-scale assault on Ukraine, Xi visited Moscow to strengthen his cooperation with Vladimir Putin. As he bade farewell to Putin at the Kremlin, Xi was captured on video telling his host, "Right now there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years, and we are the ones driving these changes together." Any realistic and effective strategy for deterring Beijing cannot be crafted in a silo, isolated from the conflicts in Europe and the Middle East. Because the crises are interrelated, so must be the responses to them. That deterrence failed in Ukraine and Israel means it stands a greater chance of failing in Taiwan. Some will argue that effective deterrence of Beijing must entail deprioritizing U.S. support for Ukraine or Israel or other partners. No doubt, prioritization and deprioritization are the essence of strategy. Given the stakes involved, along with the fact that U.S. forces would have to intervene directly and fight to prevent Taiwan's defeat in a war, there should be little question that the preponderance of American military focus should be on acquiring the means to deter and, if necessary, defeat China in war. But any strategy that underplays the conflicts in Europe and the Middle East risks inadvertently deepening those crises and inviting aggression elsewhere. That would leave us with more of the global chaos that Xi clearly values and would fuel perceptions of democratic weakness. It would be hard for even the most robust China-centric defense policy to remain credible under such conditions. There is an opportunity now to thread this strategic needle. To the fortune of democracies everywhere, the people of Ukraine and Israel have demonstrated their will and ability to fight their wars without asking any third country to sacrifice their own troops. Robust support for them by fellow democracies, through financial assistance and the provision of weapons and ammunition, would seem both economical and prudent, particularly when contrasted with the far greater costs in lives and treasure that would be required if either of those nations fell. By raising defense spending, calculated as a percentage of GDP, to something closer to the average levels of the Cold War, the United States, Europe, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and other allies can serve as a new arsenal of democracy, counterbalancing the arsenals of autocracy played by Iran, North Korea, and, above all, China. Using government spending to catalyze private industry in unorthodox ways could result in a rapid scaling up of munitions and armaments production, much as Washington's 2020 Operation Warp Speed collaboration with private companies produced hundreds of millions of COVID-19 vaccines in record time. Such an undertaking would have the benefit of resupplying our partners for their defensive wars in Europe and the Middle East, while simultaneously creating the military stockpiles needed to deter Beijing. There is evidence already that U.S. support for Ukraine has in some respects improved U.S. procurement for a war with China, by forcing the Department of Defense to kickstart manufacturing lines and replace old munitions and equipment with new inventory. The clock is ticking. While diplomacy and public statements have an important place in a well-crafted policy of deterrence, unmistakable strength in the form of military hard power is the key to persuading China to refrain from setting off a geopolitical catastrophe over Taiwan. This is what kept the Cold War cold in the last century. This is what can keep Xi from rolling the iron dice of war in this one. The czars aligned. Katherine Tai's quiet withdrawal from the free trade era. In March 2023, President Joe Biden's trade representative, Katherine Tai, was testifying before Ways and Means, a powerful congressional committee she once worked on, when a lawmaker lobbed a backhanded compliment. "I think you're too nice a person to be in the job you're in," said Representative Greg Murphy, a North Carolina Republican. "Negotiators are usually very, very tough and sometimes mean people. They aren't nice people like you are." Tai tried to dodge the jab with polite tact, noting she had no reason not to be nice to the U.S. Congress. But Murphy kept at it, adding that she had too nice a smile to effectively negotiate with an increasingly influential and aggressive China. "She'd been put in a tough spot," he said. Tai turned steely. "I don't need your pity," she countered. "I stand up for the American people. When I speak, people listen because I represent the interests of the United States." The congressman was cowed. Tai is the first woman of color to be U.S. Trade Representative, USTR. She is also the first fluent Mandarin speaker. Her parents were born in mainland China but immigrated to America from Taiwan. Unlike past trade representatives, most of whom boasted long careers in the private sector, Tai is a creature of Washington. She began clerking in the U.S. District Court in D.C. before briefly working as an associate at a private law firm. In 2007, she joined USTR as an associate general counsel focused on China trade enforcement. While there, she was heavily involved in World Trade Organization (WTO) matters, suing China in a case involving critical minerals, among other disputes. In 2014, Tai became Chief Trade Counsel for House Ways and Means. She comes from the trenches of trade policy, really working on the nitty-gritty, says Simon Lester, a China-focused economist with the Baker Institute. Yet, for all her experience and policy chops, Tai has flown relatively under the radar as USTR. As Mary Lovely, an economist at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, glumly sums up Tai's tenure, she hasn't done basically anything. While this lack of action has nothing to do with her demeanor, Tai does strike a particularly sharp contrast to her predecessor, Robert Lighthizer, who helped initiate and successfully carried out Donald Trump's trade war with China. A large man with a gravely Appalachian-tinged baritone, Lighthizer is probably what Murphy was envisioning as a trade negotiator. Lighthizer is easily riled, especially when discussing his detested bugbears like trade deficits and what he has deemed radical free trade theology. His and Trump's iconoclastic skepticism of global free trade, and in particular China's role in it, were almost preternaturally in sync, and led to the most consequential partnership in recent economic history. When you look at Lighthizer and Tai, they certainly reflect the extremes of both their parties in many ways, and that's where there's lots of commonality. Inu Manak, a trade policy fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Lighthizer was extremely empowered, says Ed Gresser, a trade official under President Bill Clinton and vice president of the Progressive Policy Institute. He was able to make very drastic threats with China and carry through on them. As USTR, Lighthizer publicly bemoaned that Beltway bureaucrats had paved China's way by allowing it into the WTO, causing an unmitigated disaster for working people. He demanded reciprocity and raised the average tariff on Chinese products from 3% in 2018 to 21% by the end of 2019, and he mapped out the contours of the Phase 1 trade deal, which, signed in January 2020, committed China to increased purchases of U.S. goods, among other measures. It was also Lighthizer who orchestrated the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, which replaced NAFTA and strengthened North American economic ties. Given this flurry of groundbreaking activity, much of it anathema to decades of mainstream economic thought, many observers in Washington and on Wall Street expected Tai to come in just as busily and loudly, at the very least reversing some of Trump's trade policies. There was a feeling that a Biden administration would want to distinguish itself from the Trump administration on this policy of high tariffs, which violated U.S. international commitments in the WTO, says Wendy Cutler, a longtime USTR negotiator who is now at the Asia Society. Biden was under tremendous pressure from the old guard to get rid of the tariffs and to just go back to stuff like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, adds Robert Kuttner, a Brandeis professor and the author of a forthcoming book on Biden. Specifically, as Biden's USTR, Tai was expected to rescind the Section 301 China tariffs, an expectation shared by Beijing. This obscure section of the 1974 trade law, shrewdly weaponized by Lighthizer, permits tariffs against countries whose trade practices are unjustifiable and burdens or restricts U.S. commerce. But Tai didn't do any liberalizing measures and has even made it clear that she has no intention to. By all accounts, she is right where the administration wants her to be, judiciously and quietly continuing America's gradual withdrawal from the neoliberal era. The China tariffs are, in my view, a significant piece of leverage, and a trade negotiator never walks away from leverage, Tai testified in a 2022 congressional hearing. The question is, how do you convert this leverage into a strategic program that will strengthen American competitiveness? Neither Lighthizer nor Tai responded to requests to be interviewed. This unexpected synergy between the administrations, manifested in their respective trade czars, reflects Washington's bipartisan consensus on China, wherein bilateral compromise is largely verboten. But observers also see in that continuity signs of a sea change in American trade attitudes more generally. If the second half of the 20th century belonged to neoliberal free traders, the first half of the 21st is shaping into a protectionist reset. What we're experiencing is a significant shift in how the U.S. approaches trade policy, and I think that shift is with us for a while, says Inu Manak, a trade policy fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations who is writing a book on this bipartisan shift. When you look at Lighthizer and Tai, they certainly reflect the extremes of both their parties in many ways, and that's where there's lots of commonality. Both Lighthizer and Tai have celebrated this shift as a transfer of power away from corporate and political elites to regular Americans. The disconnect between the elites who think primarily about foreign policy or economic efficiency and the vast majority of our people is great, writes Lighthizer in his recent memoir, No Trade is Free. It was time for the people to take back the policy. Both progressives and populists, echoed Tai recently, are meeting in a new center that is pro-worker and pro-competition, that is trying to take on oversized corporate power and looking to rebalance the equities within our system. Remarks like these have convinced observers that, whichever POTUS prevails in November, the reign of the free traders is kaput. This is not a short-term pause, stresses Robert Atkinson, an economist and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. This is a permanent hiatus. Light years. In late 1987, as American anxieties over Japanese economic ascension reached a fever pitch, a former Reagan trade appointee named Robert Lighthizer spotted a vindictive advertisement in the New York Times. For decades, Japan and other nations have been taking advantage of the United States, the full-page ad decried. It's time for us to end our vast deficits by making Japan, and others who can afford it, pay. At the time, Lighthizer was familiar with the ad's author, Donald Trump, as a tabloid star, he writes in his memoir. But Trump's reactionary call to arms resonated with the young, brash attorney from Ohio. He had pushed a similar line as deputy U.S. trade representative when confronting a mercantilist Tokyo. Over subsequent decades, as Lighthizer established a private sector career defending steel companies in international trade disputes, he cheered on Trump's pronouncements on trade and the harm done to our country by unfair imports with admiring gusto. From 1999, a year before America granted China permanent normal trade relations status, to 2011, the U.S. lost over 2 million jobs. The hemorrhaging occurred mostly in the manufacturing sector, following aggressive offshoring and a flood of Chinese imports. From 2001, when China joined the WTO, to 2017, the U.S.-China trade deficit ballooned from $83 billion to $375 billion. This period of rapid deindustrialization, known as the China shock, still reverberates through American politics, and Trump rode its waves of American carnage into the White House. For those in the trade world, Trump's tapping of Lighthizer as his chief trade representative came as little surprise. While the Manhattan billionaire could only channel America's discontent into his own political success, Lighthizer seemed to feel it at a gut level. Growing up, his hometown of Ashtabula, Ohio, was an ordinary, prosperous, bustling American city, one of many such places, he writes in his memoir. In his estimation, poor international trade policy, alongside automation and other advances, wrecked it. Nearly a third of residents are now impoverished in Ashtabula, less than 10% have a college degree. Growing up in Ashtabula doesn't hold as much promise these days, he gripes. Our country simply does not make many of the things we need anymore. In meetings with administration colleagues, Lighthizer mentioned his Ohio upbringing every day, recounts Clete Willems, a trade lawyer who served under Lighthizer in the administration. And in the White House, it gave Lighthizer rare freedom to maneuver. Throughout Trump's tumultuous term, as so many cabinet members fell out of presidential favor, Lighthizer remained in sterling repute. When asked in a recent Fox News town hall whom he might bring back into a second term, Trump named only Lighthizer. He's an excellent negotiator and he understands leverage, says Willems. Everyone respected him, including the president. But 5 years on from its first shots, results of Trump and Lighthizer's trade war are mixed. The fraction of Chinese imports into America has fallen by a third since 2017. The trade deficit with China did shrink. But some economists say this was offset by growing deficits with other large exporters like Vietnam and Mexico, which last year surpassed China as the biggest source of American imports. Many of the manufacturers there, in booming border states like Nuevo Leon, are Chinese firms that simply relocated to Mexico, where they face lower tariffs. In 2022, China's direct investment in Mexico reached $587 million, the highest on record, according to Mexico's economic secretary. Yet much of the dire predictions made at the beginning of the trade war, such as rampant tariff-induced inflation, have not come to pass. While importers paid most of the cost of the China tariffs, it was retailers, not consumers, who swallowed the bulk of the cost, limiting inflationary effects, according to one study. The 301 tariffs began this process of reducing our dependence on China, decoupling from the Chinese economy and basically setting an example that you can put tariffs on a country and the world doesn't end. The sky does not fall in, says Jeff Ferry, chief economist for the Conservative Coalition for a Prosperous America. Meanwhile, the politics of China trade have become more Lighthizer-ian. Absent a small contingent of climate-focused Democrats who argue that America should import more cheap renewable energy products from China, both parties are content to minimize trade in the name of de-risking and establishing a level playing field, the decoupling euphemism of the moment. The Biden people might say some good things here and there about trade and globalization, but at the end of the day they're a lot closer to Trump than they are to Obama. Robert Atkinson, an economist and president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, Tai, for her part, has held these politics for a while, although she briefs as more East Coast elite than Lighthizer's small-town champion. Born in Connecticut, Tai grew up in the D.C. metro area, where her parents worked as federal medical researchers. At Yale, Tai majored in history with a focus on Asia. Afterwards, she lived in Guangzhou for 2 years, teaching English as a Yale China Fellow, and later earned her J.D. at Harvard Law. While rising the ranks in D.C., she kept her political cards close. To many observers, she seemed to be more or less on board with the free trade consensus. Lighthizer really believes what he's doing, and he's really committed to that vision, says Atkinson, who knows Tai. For Tai, it was a little more of an evolution into this. Congressman Earl Blumenauer of Oregon and Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, both longtime critics of American trade policy, became allies, for instance, as Tai gradually fell in with the more progressive end of the Democratic spectrum. And as American polarization expanded across issues, the more extreme ends of the parties actually inched closer on trade policy. Bidenomics, observers note, is the culmination of this evolution. The progressive left has a lot in common with the Trump Republicans when it comes to trade: more protectionist, more focused on building U.S. manufacturing and less interested in opening markets, says Cutler. Their skepticism is based on the belief, like Lighthizer, that trade agreements have contributed to income inequality and resulted in the offshoring of U.S. jobs. One of the key stepping stones in Tai's ascent, for instance, was the Rapid Response Mechanism, a component of USMCA, Trump's NAFTA replacement, which she co-designed to swiftly address labor disputes. She was the lead House Democrat staffer on the USMCA negotiations between Lighthizer and Congress to make the agreement more amenable to Democrats who had just taken the House. Her performance as a really tough negotiator, says Manak, had her noticed by higher-ups as a worker-centered trade thinker, a Biden coinage that Tai often parrots. The mechanism was an effort to include more provisions in the agreement to make it more attractive particularly to the labor community, says Cutler, adding that when it comes to trade, Biden is a traditional labor Democrat. If you look at his voting record before he became president on free trade agreements, he voted against a lot of them, she says. His true colors on trade and his concerns about whether trade has benefited workers led to the policies that are being pursued now. In his USMCA negotiation with Tai, Lighthizer came away with a fond impression of his successor. In his recounting of that period in No Trade is Free, he refers to the Rapid Response Mechanism as groundbreaking and his Democratic successor as the estimable Katherine Tai. The two trade czars are similarly minded on the WTO, the longtime punching bag of American trade skeptics. Unlike Lighthizer, who freely bashed the body as wholly inadequate, Tai chafes at accusations of ill will, but in practice, she is hardly more supportive. I really bristle at this narrative that the United States is WTO inconsistent because that calls into question our good faith and engagement and our good faith as a WTO member, she remarked during a Q&A in September. Yet under Tai's watch, the U.S. has let the organization wither on the vine, refusing to nominate key officials, basically paralyzing it. I think she's been disingenuous in her support for the WTO, says Lovely, of the Peterson Institute, which is a longtime bastion of free trade triumphalism. She claims that they support the WTO, but then the U.S. remains one of the main barriers to creating progress there. In late 2022, Tai excoriated a WTO ruling in a steel and aluminum case brought by China for allegedly impinging on American sovereignty, adding the organization was on very, very thin ice. Lighthizer, he writes in his memoir, couldn't have said it better myself. Protectionist racket. On both ends of the partisan horseshoe, Tai and Lightthizer's skeptical reassessment clashes with mainstream economic thought, which posits free trade as, more or less, universally good for Americans. And it has been good by several metrics. Between 2000 and 2007, the purchasing power of Americans increased by $1,500, a massive gain, due to increased trade with China. Prices for staple goods plummeted. A 1% increase in imports was associated with a 1.4% decrease in U.S. prices. Moreover, GDP economic losses in manufacturing have been offset multiple times over by gains in other industries like tech, which benefited enormously from Chinese manufacturing. To castigate free trade as harmful for Americans is totally misguided, says Gary Hufbauer, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute. If America continues down the protectionist path, Hufbauer continues, we're going to lose a lot of the efficiency benefits of trade to the U.S. economy and throw out a lot of babies with the bathwater. How Tai paints trade with China as hollowing out America and being bad for workers ignores all the people in the service sector who really benefited, adds Lovely, pointing to jobs that appeared in human resources, marketing and sales in the tech sector. There were thousands and thousands of jobs created. For Tai and Lightthizer's defenders, who ridicule economists as too beholden to models and theories they say have been discredited, it is a confrontation long in the making. Since the mid-1980s, Bob has recognized that the theoretical underpinning of America's post-World War II free trade doctrine is mushy to say the least, says Clyde Prestovitz, a former Reagan trade negotiator who worked with Lighthizer in that administration. Bob lives in the real world, and I think the same is true of Katherine Tai. But where Lighthizer was granted carte blanche to pursue his reformist mission, Tai must navigate a much tighter political space. The reason the Biden administration has to hide the ball is because there's a lot of rich Democratic donors who still want global integration, particularly in the finance community, says Atkinson. So the Biden people might say some good things here and there about trade and globalization, but at the end of the day they're a lot closer to Trump than they are to Obama. All of corporate America wanted to go back to the status quo ante, adds Kudner. You also had all these people who built their careers on that model of free trade. Now it's a tug of war where Katherine Tai is the rope they're pulling on in two directions. The most provocative moment of Tai's tenure occurred in October, when Tai unexpectedly withdrew Trump-era proposals in a WTO negotiation over cross-border data flows. In their way, these proposals were free trade for the digital world, allowing for free cross-border data flows and prohibiting national requirements for data localization for e-commerce companies. Many multinationals were eager to see them enacted. Riva Gujan, a China expert and director of the Rhodium Group, notes that many observers thought it was a given that the U.S. would lead by example as an ardent proponent of unfettered cross-border data flows in the name of preserving the principles behind a free and open Internet. But Tai withdrew them, she said, in order to give the administration more room for its antitrust maneuverings with big tech firms. USTR inherited the Trump-era tariffs and has been in this very uncomfortable position of defending the continuation of those tariffs but also not having much to show for new initiatives. Riva Gujan, a China expert and director of the Rhodium Group. Tai's steady stewardship of America's withdrawal from free trade principles has largely gone unnoticed because it's been eclipsed by another important shift in American trade policy, that the USTR is just one instrument in a larger toolbox. In prosecuting China policy, Biden has relied less on USTR as Trump did and more on the Commerce Department, which issues export controls, and the Treasury Department, which screens outbound investments, deploying the arsenals of each department in a more surgical way. The center of gravity shifted under the Biden administration in terms of which agency has been most active in trying to provide new solutions around de-risking efforts, says Gujan. So USTR inherited the Trump-era tariffs and has been in this very uncomfortable position of defending the continuation of those tariffs but also not having much to show for new initiatives. If Trump returns as president, the center of gravity could shift back. On the campaign trail, Trump has indicated that the trade war would scale up, saying that he would issue more than 60% tariffs on all Chinese imports. Willems, the USTR official under Trump, sees this proposal more as a negotiating tactic than an actual possibility. Multiple sources also say that Lighthizer would be a candidate for Treasury Secretary. Willems indicated it could be a good fit given Lighthizer's interest in his book of using currency and tax policy to reduce trade deficits. He could, for instance, try to crack down on China's alleged currency manipulation or pursue a border-adjustable tax. Under either administration, one dramatic possibility for the near future is the revocation of China's Permanent Normal Trade Relation (PNTR) status. The president does not have the authority to do this on his own, but Congress does, says Manak. The House Select Committee on China, an influential bipartisan body, has recently indicated that it might support such a drastic move. Lighthizer himself advocated for it during testimony to the committee last year. In his memoir, he calls the U.S. granting China PNTR one of the worst mistakes in its history. Before this, America's annual review of China's trading status had served as a vital bargaining chip in dealing with Beijing, and Lighthizer wants to bring that leverage back. If this were to happen, experts warn, it would massively disrupt U.S.-China trade by sparking a large Chinese retaliation. If I had to guess, I would say China's reaction would be a mix of targeted retaliatory tariffs on U.S. agricultural products, as well as measures to restrict U.S. investments in China or how U.S. firms operate in China, says Manak. I also wouldn't be surprised to see export controls applied on critical minerals and other strategic goods that the United States needs. A recent report from Oxford Economics, a consultancy, estimates that it could result in a $2 trillion loss in the U.S. GDP. It's not as clear what a second Biden administration would bring to trade policy. Tai would probably be out, as trade representatives typically serve a single term. The job is said to be extremely stressful. Observers say it's not clear who might replace her yet, but many guessed she would leave the government for a think tank. Her legacy, however, of overseeing this shift in U.S. policy seems secure. It seems that Biden has settled into a comfortable acceptance of Trump's protectionist themes, with quieter decibels, and that suits unions and progressive Democrats fine, so a dramatic change would surprise me, predicts Hufbauer. More likely is a ramping up of trade restrictions against China, stretching the small yard to include autos as well as anything with a genuine national security flavor. In May, the same month that Lighthizer called for PNTR revocation at the Select Committee, Tai sounded an optimistic note about the future of global trade. I remain convinced that through all of this disruption we're moving towards a new economic order, she said in a press interview. I'd really like to fill that gap with a positive vision that we will be prepared for it. Part of that positive vision will likely involve rearranging Lighthizer's disruption into a more coherent program, sweeping up the proverbial China shop after a bull has passed through it. But until then, Tai's job is simply to ensure no one puts things back the way they were.
大家好，我们非常高兴地为大家带来区块链和游戏世界中的一个激动人心的消息。六度链推出全新平台，将彻底改变我们与信息互动的方式。在这个游戏化的平台上，您可以评估内容、预测结果并赢取奖励。想象一下，一个游戏让您的见解塑造信息价值，并为此获得奖励。敬请期待，这是一个您不想错过的社区驱动体验。游戏即将开始。